and welcome to another episode of the Big Game Hunters. I'm Mike.
And I'm Tom. Today's episode, we have Seasons, the dice drafting game from Asmodee. But first, Chit Chat.
That's right, and in today's Chit Chat, we're going to be talking about luck, the merits of luck, and how to mitigate random factors in games. We really hope you enjoy the show. Hi, and welcome to today's Chit Chat on luck and luck mitigation. So this is going to be more of a clash, I think, than our typical Chit Chats.
Probably.
Because, from my experience playing with you, Tom, we differ on our tolerance for luck. We have a little bit different desires when it goes into a game about how much randomness we want and how much we want that to determine the victor. I personally like a moderately low level of luck. Mm-hmm. I don't want to feel like the dice determined who won. I want to feel like I like games where I can trace kind of where things went awry for my opponent or me, or what really clinched the victory. I like to be able to the game to tell a story and to have a clear path to victory for somebody.
Well, before I address my preferences on luck, which I will, I want to.
We're all waiting with bated breath, Tom.
We I think should define a few terms first.
Okay.
So when we say luck, we mean any random factor in the game that it has a positive or negative outcome that you can't influence. Agreed?
Yes, I will accept that definition.
Okay. I guess that's just important because uncertainty is also an element in a game, but that's different from luck because usually that's something you also can't control, but also can't influence, like another player's actions kind of things.
Or a concealed hand.
There you go.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, I like luck in games because it does a few things. First of all, it brings skill levels together. So, for example, you're a very experienced gamer. I'm a less experienced gamer. But if we play a game that has a fair amount of luck, say, for example, our favorite Epic Duels, or one we just recently reviewed, Last Night on Earth, the luck elements in those games keep me on a competitive level with you. Now, ideally, we're getting into my preference for luck now. Ideally, a player's skill will lead them to victory, but a less skilled player can still feel like they are competing because luck is either helping the poor player or slowing down the good player. Now, there's no guarantee that'll happen, obviously. The results can be good or bad, but I think it helps to mitigate that disparity in player skillship.
Yeah.
Is that a word, skillship?
No, but
okay, great.
I think what you said there is interesting, and that reminds me of so when we went to Metatopia, shameless plug, we went to a panel by James Ernest, another shameless plug, and
you dropped that name.
Oh, yeah, sorry, let me get that. And he defined a game, and I remember this. I really like this definition. He said a game is fun so long as every player believes he or she has a reasonable chance of winning.
Yep.
And he emphasized that the players it's important that players believe they have that chance. So even if it's not necessarily true, they just have to maybe not be able to see behind the curtain and think that they can win. And also reasonable. Some players have different ideas of what is a reasonable chance to win, but you don't want a situation where very early in the game, somebody feels like they have no chance to compete because the variables have fallen against them, or they've made really bad decisions, and they're just a prisoner of the game then. And so, and the example he used was in certain games like poker, it's okay if there's a lot of luck because they're quick hands. They're over fast. If you're dealt a bad one, you don't have to live with it for very long. So it's not too much of an issue if you're dealt an unplayable situation.
Yep.
But in longer games, I think this really comes up in war games a lot, and that's one of the reasons I'm not as into them, is that if you have some bad rolls early,
it can be hard to come back.
It can be hard to come back, and you could be sitting there for an hour or two just trying to get to a point where you can say definitively that you can't win, when really it's been heading in that direction for quite a while.
So, to use some examples of games we've recently reviewed,
absolutely,
we said Mage Wars. It's a highly skilled game. Almost every decision is player based, but we gave it a higher luck score than normal for that type of game because the dice were so important to that game. Same kind of element, I think, with Last Night on Earth. It has Mostly it's a luck-based game with the dice and the random card draws, and I feel there's a little bit of skill that can help mitigate those things, and you sort of disagree about that point. So in games like that, where you have both elements, not necessarily in equal portion, but ideally the skill would lead the player to victory, what kinds of things do you like to see in games that help mitigate that luck?
Sure. So I think first I want to talk briefly about what I think increases that luck. So you mentioned, for instance, Last Night on Earth and Mage Wars. Mage Wars, we covered the dice. That's pretty much it for Mage Wars. With Last Night on Earth, the dice are also present. They're also important. A few bad rolls can kill your hero instantly. But I think also the variability in the cards in Last Night on Earth. So by contrast, one way to lessen luck in a game, one thing I like to see is pretty balanced and pretty they don't have to be samey, but they have to be roughly of equal strength cards in a game. So if you have an event deck or if you have a skills deck or of some kind, you don't want them to vary wildly in power level if you want to minimize the luck. Because in Last Night on Earth, you have things that to blow up a whole horde of zombies. You have things that can maybe open a door. So it really runs the gamut, and so by contrast, one way to mitigate luck is to have kind of similar cards, balanced cards. Another thing is with dice, rather than you having dice that are simply 1 through 6 or just one value is completely better than another, maybe different colored dice. So one thing we're going to talk about very soon in Seasons. And one of the real big selling points of that game for me, spoiler alert, is that the dice sides are very well balanced. And every dice side gives you a different advantage. Some will be better situationally than others, and that's fine. But one is not purely better.
Strictly better, right.
Strictly better, right. So, it's not like we're just, you roll, I roll, the higher roller wins. We each have advantages going forward when we roll those dice. So I think, those are... the big ones is the different...
Paying for randomness also. Say, for example, you have a mechanic where you roll on a chart, but later in the game, if you have enough resources, you can pay for your result on the chart rather than rolling. That's another
Sure. And if there's enough rolling or enough drawing, that also can form more of a curve. So if, like in something like Race for the Galaxy or any deck building game like Thunderstone, you're going to be drawing a lot of cards throughout the game. I mean, in Thunderstone, you're drawing 6 cards every turn from your deck, which is of varying size, but you're going to see a lot of hands. And so even if some of them are kind of weak, on the whole, they should balance out. On the dice side, again, we're going to talk about soon Nexus Ops. I really like the way Nexus Ops handles combat because when you're rolling to fight, the player who's taking the hits chooses the casualties, and you can choose your weakest units first.
Yep.
So kind of like you can pay for a die result, there are options in Nexus Ops to kind of ensure your victory short of something really big happening.
To keep the guys with the better die options alive longer.
And you can reasonably in that game avoid the dice being the big factor.
Right.
So I guess I'm okay with a little gambling in a game, but I don't want it to be the driving force. I don't want to feel like I lost to somebody making a really ridiculous gamble.
That does bring up another interesting point about luck, is that it can sort of protect people's egos. So another way people are vested in games is that they like to have fun, and if you're constantly being stumped by the better player, being able to blame luck sort of keeps you interested in continuing to play.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you do hear that a lot. Sometimes I'll be at a table with somebody, and they'll won't be able to see the forest for the trees. They'll say, "Oh, you know what? These rolls I could not possibly have won. These draws are crap. I couldn't have gotten out of this no matter what I did." Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. But you're right. The fact that there's an element of destiny involved means that you don't bear the full burden of responsibility for winning or losing.
And it also can help the triumph too. So even the skilled player who can overcome luck on a regular basis through their skill.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's also an ego booster, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly can be. So, in closing, I guess, what kinds of games do you think should have a high amount of luck?
What kinds of games?
Like, what kind of games do you think luck is appropriate?
Well, I think the best games for luck are the games where you are I guess I hesitate to say party game because that is a genre of game,
Sure.
but it's the kind of game where people are socializing. Maybe not everyone's at the table at all times. Those are the best games for the most lucky games.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Something comes to mind with I think we'll review is Guillotine.
Oh yeah.
I know that's one we played together,
Yep.
and yeah, it's a very thematic game, very fun game, very light. So I think any game that has some levity to it is simple. You can pull it out and play with anybody, with grandma.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good one for luck. It annoys me, I think, in games like Last Night on Earth specifically, because they're so elaborate. You have to get so invested, and the luck pulls me out of it. But I think there are games where luck has a good place.
I can't disagree.
All right, great. So, on that note of agreement, I think we will move on to talking about seasons. Seasons is a dice drafting, tableau building game from Asmodee. To win, you must collect the most prestige points over 3 years. At the end of the third year, the game ends and scores are tallied. Seasons is played with a variety of colorful components, the most prominent of which are the dice. The dice depict a variety of symbols that will tell you what you gain at the beginning of your turn if you choose that die. If you see a number, you'll gain that many crystals. If you see a card, you'll draw one card, and you may choose to keep or discard it immediately. If you see energy symbols, such as these two feathers, or this water droplet and feather, you'll gain that amount of energy in those types, and you'll add it to your reserve. There are 4 types of energy in the game: fire, wind, water, and earth. If you see a star, you'll increase your summoning gauge by 1. Your summoning gauge determines how many power cards you can have out in front of you. You can have 1 power card for every point on your summoning gauge. Finally, you may see a transmutation circle around the outside of your die. A transmutation circle allows you to transmute at any time during your turn, and potentially multiple times during your turn. That brings me to the season tracker. When you transmute, you'll gain crystals by trading in energy from your reserve. The number you gain is dependent on the season. As you play the game, you'll move along the outside of this tracker. You start on year 1, season 1, and move forward at the end of the turn based on the number of pips shown on the last unchosen die. If you see 2 pips, you'll move 2 seasons forward, so 2 months forward. If you see 3 pips, you'll move 3 months, and if you see 1 pip, you'll move 1 month. The tracker tracks transmutation by rarity. So for instance, when you're using the blue dice in winter, water and wind will be plentiful, but earth will be very rare. For that reason, when you trade in water or air, you gain 1 crystal per unit transmuted. When you trade in earth, though, you gain 3, and when you trade fire, you gain 2. Each player will also have a player board. The player board has slots along the top called your reserve. This is where you keep energy tokens that you gain through your dice and other means. It also features a summoning gauge, which goes from 0 to 15, and tells you how many power cards you may have in play. And finally, it has various bonuses that are tracked on the bonus tracker. Throughout the game, you can take up to 3 different bonuses. Each bonus you take decreases your score at the end of the game by a bit more. The first bonus costs 5 points at the end of the game, the second 12, and the third 20. The different bonuses are as follows. The first bonus allows you to exchange 2 energy in your reserve for any 2 different energy. There are no limitations on this transaction. You can trade any 2 for any 2 other types. The next bonus allows you to transmute during your turn when you wouldn't otherwise be able to. In addition, your transmutations are always worth at least 1 extra crystal, even if you could already transmute. Next, you may use this bonus to increase your summoning gauge by 1. And finally, you may use the 4th bonus to draw an additional card anytime you would draw a card through the die effect. So, when you roll the card draw, rather than simply drawing the top card of the deck and either keeping or discarding it, you draw 2 cards and keep 1 of them. Finally, in the meat of the game are the power cards. Power cards come in 2 types: magical objects, which are purple, and familiars, which are orange. At the top of the card, you'll see a number indicating how much prestige is worth at the end of the game. Remember that the player who has the most prestige wins the game. In the middle, you'll see the cost to play the card. This card costs a number of crystals that is dependent on the number of players. At the bottom, you'll see the type of ability it has and what the ability is. This circular arrow indicates that it's a consistent ability. It's active at all times. Cards also frequently cost energy from your reserve rather than crystals. This symbol at the bottom means that this card's effect only comes into play when the card is played. Finally, there are cards that you must activate in order to use. This card must essentially be tapped in order to use its ability. To play seasons at the Archmage level, you will first have to draft the power cards. This phase is known as the Prelude. To begin, each player is dealt 9 cards from the deck. Each player takes a look at his hand, chooses one card, places it in front of him, and passes the rest of the cards to his left. You continue taking and passing cards in this way until each player has drafted 9 cards. Then, you'll take your cards you've drafted and put them into 3 stacks of 3. You'll take the Year 2 and Year 3 token and place it over the other 2 stacks. The first stack will begin in your hand, and the other 2 stacks will be added to your hand during their respective years. Once you finish drafting the cards, it's time to begin the tournament phase of the game. For the tournament phase, which will be the remainder of gameplay, you're first going to roll the dice that match the appropriate season. If you're playing a 3-player game, you'll roll 4 dice. Assuming you are in winter, you'll roll the blue dice. Once the dice have been rolled, each player will draft 1 die. There will be a starting player. There is not a starting player token included in the game. We like to use one of the extra chits. The starting player, who also rolled the dice, will choose 1 die and lock it into the slot on his player board. Once he's locked his die, the other 2 players will choose their dice in turn order. Then, the players take their turns in the same order. So, the turn player will first gain the resources depicted on the die. In this case, he would gain 2 water tokens from the stockpile, and he would increase his summoning gauge by 1 as indicated by the star. Then, that player can play any number of power cards he or she can pay for, and can use any number of power card effects. Remember that you must always note the summoning gauge for the number of power cards you can have in front of you. In addition, the player can use any number of his bonuses, as explained in the components section of this tutorial. The bonuses may be repeated, and you can use any number you like on a turn, up to the maximum of 3, which again will deduct 20 points from your score at the end. Once a player has used any bonuses he wishes, played any power cards, and used any power card effects he would like, play passes to the next player, and you keep repeating this process until the end of the 3rd year. It's important to remember that after every player is gone, you will use the unpicked season die and advance the tracker that number of months. In this way, you will move around the seasons and move through the years. That's how you play seasons. Now that you know how to play seasons, Tom and I are going to take a look at it in our point-counterpoint review.
Since Mike and I agree on the game, we're going to roll for who's going to argue for the game and who's going to argue against it. If the roll is even, I get the, what do I get?
You are for the game if it's even, and if it's odd, I'm for the game.
Thank you.
Anytime.
It's odd.
So I love this game.
And I hate it.
I've loved it all my life. Tom can't stand it.
That's right.
And the reason that Tom is wrong in his hatred of this game is that the season wheel really pulls you in. It really works well. It drives the whole experience. Get this out of here. And I just think it's so unique to this game. So when I am trying to sell this game to people, when I'm trying to really endorse it, I always bring up the season wheel because you have this very cool kind of fluctuating economy as you're playing through this tableau builder. And that's something I haven't seen in other tableau builders. It's something I really like. It works on a thematic level. I like the idea that water and wind are prevalent in winter, whereas nothing is growing, so there's no earth. I like the idea that by contrast in spring, in summer, it's hot, fire is everywhere. Just, it's in a weird climate we live in. And, earth is also there. There's a lot of vegetation. So I think it works kind of on that level. I think it really makes some for some nice decision making when you have extra resources in your tray, deciding when to transmute or when to hold. So yeah, I think it also, with the pips, I think you have some extra decision making when you're picking your die, because you have to consider if you want a long game or a short game. And where you're in that third player slot, I usually play 3 players. When you're in the last player slot, you have a little more control over the length of the game. So if you're playing a long, drawn-out strategy, you can maybe slow down the seasons.
I can't disagree. I also love the season wheel.
Who doesn't?
However, the rest of the game, the components have a few problems. So first, let's start with the little stuff. First of all, the score chart. These rows aren't even. It's pretty inconvenient to have to, count up 4, 6, whatever. We like our rows to be nice and even, 5, 10, whatever.
I have the same experience in Couriers where you go snake up the track.
Some other problems we have are the color of fire. It's yellow.
Why is it yellow?
Why is it yellow? The tap symbol or the gear mechanic is the symbol for tapping, but the symbol on the card for playing it looks like a tap symbol.
Yeah, this is a continuous card. You don't tap it, but it's got the tap icon for Magic, let's face it.
But the real big problem with the game, as evidenced on the season wheel, is that the crystal icon, these white ones are crystal icons, they look pretty similar to the fire icon. So if you see that on one of the power cards, you can be confused about what kind of thing you need to do.
Yeah, several players have confused on that in their first playthrough.
So the components, season wheel great, the rest of the components need a little work.
Yeah, and I think also along the same lines, the crystals and the prestige have a little bit of a confusing distinction. I think when I'm teaching the game,
good point.
I usually find that people, and I think it's a little weird too, that there really just does not need to be both. I understand that you can spend crystals on cards and effects, and you don't spend prestige, but really they could have been rolled into one. It's a needless distinction. It adds a little bit of complexity to an otherwise very clean game.
Yep.
However, even though the components, and there's a little bit of confusion with the points there, the dice, which also I think drive the game, this is the other thing I always like to talk about. The dice are really well balanced. In our Chit Chat today, we discussed ways to mitigate luck. Mm-hmm. So if you haven't watched the Chit Chat yet, go do it now. In the Chit Chat, we discussed ways to mitigate luck, and we said that this game is a good example of when you're rolling a die, you don't have 1 through 6, you don't have just a gradation, you have things that are different but roughly equivalent. And this game does a really nice job of that. So there are times when I want a card, there are times when I want particular resources, there are times when I need summoning gauge, but I always feel like I'm getting something. Mm-hmm. I always feel like I'm improving my game in some way. I always feel like I'm advancing my tableau, no matter what symbols I get.
Yep.
So the drafting the dice is a good mechanic. It works well. I want particular symbols at different times, but I never feel like I'm being shafted by the dice.
That's right.
I love that.
Well, while the dice are roughly balanced, you might sometimes not get the greatest choice, but you always get a choice. That's not necessarily true of how the cards work. The card power scale it just gets crazy at some points. There's some useful basic cards, and they ramp up a little bit, but then we get to some pretty crazy ones, like Divine Chalice, Crystal Orb, Vampiric Crown.
Yeah.
We don't need them.
Don't want them.
These cards are way too powerful for the game. They can turn a losing player into a winning player. They can give the winning player just such an insurmountable lead. They're too much. We got rid of them.
And they just ramp up the luck factor. I totally agree on this one, Tom. I'm totally with you. They ramp up the luck factor so much on a game that otherwise has very little.
We'll talk about that in the breakdown a little bit, but right. This is a highly skilled game that if it really weren't for those cards, wouldn't have much of a luck factor.
I agree. And you know what? The other thing I hate about having the imbalanced cards is it really cuts into what I like to talk about in this game, which is emergent strategy. So unlike other tableau builders, this one has a little more interaction, but it also has a little less kind of hand-holding with the strategies. So in a lot of tableau builders, like say Gloria Rome, you have the different colors of buildings, and usually you're going to want to kind of specialize in one of them. You are rewarded for picking a color and sticking with it. Same is true of Race of the Galaxy. It's kind of true of deck builders like Thunderstar Dominion, where you're rewarded for picking a distinct strategy, a distinct card category usually, and riding that to victory. Mm-hmm. But in this, the cards are a little more amorphous. The strategies are a little harder to pin down. They're a little less obvious. And so as you play this a little bit, you start to see synergies emerge with the cards. You start to see different combinations that work. And then when you're building your tableau, rather than saying, I just want green in Race of the Galaxy, I just want more and more alien worlds or more genetic worlds, you're saying, I have this that I can tap to increase the value of my transmutations. This card also works with transmutations. I'll kind of pull that in. Or, I have a lot of familiars. If I grab this card, lets me sacrifice familiars for points. I'll grab that. So it seems very organic to me, and I really enjoy that about this game. I think it gives a tremendous replay value, and it feels like I'm coming up with something unique when I'm building my tableau.
That's all true. I guess our last problem with the game would have to be, we've been talking about how the cards play, how the dice work, how the season wheel is awesome.
It is.
But we're not really part of the game, are we? We're not really immersed in the idea that the seasons are cycling and that are we wizards that control this? I don't know what's going on. The problem with that, I think, is a real missed opportunity with, especially the power cards. Like there's familiars and there's wizards and items and spells and things, and none of that really ties into the idea of the wheel. The wheel is really the only thing we have that conveys the thematic element of the game, and the rest is really a missed opportunity for me.
I agree. I'm not really sure what the design was going for in terms of the season wheel and the energies that correspond to the elements. And then you have this kind of tack-on idea of familiars and magical items that don't really connect. I mean, it's called seasons. You have the season wheel. I'm good with all that. The energy tokens all fits together.
Yep.
But then the power cards seem to have nothing to do with them. I can think of maybe one air elemental that transmutes everything into air.
Yeah.
I know you're fond of that card.
Yeah, it's a lovely card.
But for the most part, you don't like the water amulet doesn't do things that evoke water. It's
Right.
not like the fire element is unpredictable and does things that I would think of traditionally with fire. Magic, the Gathering, for instance, is very good at connecting their colors with certain aspects.
With their thematic mechanics, right?
But this just didn't go for that, and I think that was a miss. But on the whole, I'm still a big fan. I really enjoy Seasons. The mechanics are unique enough, and they drive it enough for me that I can overlook the weird theming. And I would actually give this a 9 out of 10 because I've played this a lot. I enjoy it every time. I feel like I'm fully engaged when I play it, even without a theme.
Yep.
It's a real hit in my book.
I've been waffling between 7 and 8. I can't decide. I think I'm going to give it a final of 8 because anytime it's going to be brought out, I'd be glad to play it. And it is a really well designed and fun game.
Yeah, great.
Fun is the word I'm looking for.
Great deep tableau builder, a lot of fun, to use the technical vernacular. And maybe to use the technical vernacular, we will go to the breakdown.
All right, it's time for the breakdown with Seasons from Asmodee. Like almost any game, the more players, the more time it's going to take, but you can usually complete a game in an hour and a half to 2 hours, so we gave it 35 short, 65 long. On the fast-slow scale, it's an even split at 50-50. The game progresses quickly, and the turns are pretty short, but your turns are also isolated. We gave it 80 skill and 20 luck because it is a strategic drafting game, but with the power curve in the cards and a little bit from the dice, there's a little bit of luck. Strategy is at 85 because you're always weighing your current options against your future needs. We gave it 15 in tactics because even those tactical elements like hate drafting have an effect on your future strategy. Independence is at 70 because the turns are mostly isolated. There is a little bit of card interaction and of course the drafting, so we give it 30 interaction. We gave it 20 immersion and 80 abstraction because while the wheel is evocative and really does sort of tie into the seasonal theme, the rest is mechanical and maybe a missed opportunity. At the heart of the game, it's straightforward and easy to learn, but there are a few confusing parts with the components, so we give it 80 simplicity, 20 complexity. We have a 50-50 split on portability and grandeur. It doesn't take much room on the table, and the box is of average size. There's not a lot to say there. For completeness and expandability, we give it a 65 complete because it is a full game, but it is a drafting game, so there's always room for more cards. Plus, Mike would really like to see an expansion. For our trophy scales, we have originality with 4 trophies. The wheel is really unique. It functions in so many different ways. It's a game clock, it's a die reference, it's a resource chart. It's just super original. And then for value, we give it 3 trophies. The price is fair and the components are fine, but there's nothing exceptional. So that's the breakdown for Seasons. Mike gave it a 9, and Tom gave it an 8.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Big Game Hunters, and we hope you enjoyed playing Seasons as much as Tom and I did. Next week in the Chit Chat, we're going to be talking about game criticism, the idea that there may not be enough academic rigor in the way we talk about board games. And we're going to be playing Space Cadets, a fun cooperative game from Stronghold Games.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel for regular updates. See the links below for Twitter and Facebook, and leave us a comment on what you think about luck.
That's right. See you next week.
Goodbye.
Goodbye!